Fulgencio Batista was the elected president of Cuba from 1934 to 1944. During his presidency, Cuba and the U.S. maintained a steady relationship due to the fact that Batista indulged the U.S. with agriculture companies in Cuba, Cuban real estate, and the use of Guantanamo Bay. In 1952, the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba began to dwindle when Fulgencio Batista decided to lead a coup to reinstate himself as the leader of Cuba after his presidential term was complete. He initially kept close ties with the U.S. to protect American interests in Cuba, but U.S. support ended as his rule became more and more oppressive. Batista ended democracy in Cuba, enraging many, including U.S. students and, most importantly, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was especially unhappy with the lack of democracy and inequality in Cuba, so he launched an attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953 in protest of Batista's dictatorship. The attack failed, and he spent 2 years in prison in Mexico. During his time in Mexico, Castro met Ernesto Che Guevara, a Marxist. Together, they launched a plan using guerrilla warfare to plan an attack in Cuba to free it from Fulgencio Batista. In 1956, Castro and his crew land in Cuba and seek shelter in the Sierra Maestra. While in Cuba, he gained support from the rural and peasant class with his Che-inspired Marxist ideals. Castro prevailed against Batista through his use of sabotage, his control of schools and hospitals, along with his utilization of guerrilla warfare. On December 31, 1958, Batista resigned, and on January 8, 1959, Castro enters Havana and controls Cuba. Castro taking control worried the U.S., especially as he began to align Cuba more and more with the USSR. Bay of Pigs was one of the major plans launched against Castro. Initiated by Eisenhower, JFK approved the attack that would supposedly start an uprising in Cuba and get Castro out of power. The U.S. trained exiles in Central America and provided weapons, but didn't give direct support during invasion in order to avoid getting into a war with Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a complete failure and really pushed Castro to get support from USSR. The United States were becoming increasingly worried about the blossoming relationship between Castro and Khrushchev. Therefore, Operation Mongoose was put into motion, as a way of getting rid of Castro by any means necessary. This led to constant flights of U.S. spy planes over Cuba. On October 14, 1962, the U.S. discovered nuclear missile sites in Cuba. America's initial plan was to pressure the USSR and the UN to get rid of the nuclear missile sites in Cuba. On October 22, Kennedy made a public address to the U.S. and started a naval quarantine blockade of Cuba. The USSR claimed that the missiles in Cuba were only defensive, and that any attack on Cuba would be perceived as a declaration of war against the USSR. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, rivaled against President John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy didn't want any missiles in Cuba, but was resistant on removing U.S. missiles in Turkey. Only when JFK found out that it was pre-planned that the U.S. was already going to remove the missiles in Turkey, did he agree to Khrushchev's proposition. RFK, the POTUS's brother, was sent to meet the USSR and agreed to remove the missiles in Turkey and that the USSR would remove the missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev and the president would not meet personally, as this would weaken their image as the leader of their respective countries. With this, the Cuban Missile Crisis was ended and tensions between the US and USSR decreased.